Thank you so much, Amira, for your generous introduction. I think this symposium is very timely and important. I feel honored to be part of it in this beautiful city. As the organizers put it, the reassertion of the centrality of language in AI has led to numerous technological breakthroughs and philosophical debates in recent decades. There's been a widespread sense of urgency and almost panic surrounding the question of what AI might do to our environment, to social economic relations, to the future of politics, and to the refashioning of the world. So it makes perfect sense to ask the question, what does it mean for the machine to automate labor further, mental labor as well as physical labor, if I'm allowed to use an old-fashioned description of the division of labor? To push the question in a slightly different direction, what is so mental about language, philosophically speaking? This, of course, is not a new question. Philosophers have speculated and debated about it for decades, but the ground of those debates could be re-examined in light of Ludwig Wittgenstein's well-known critique of metaphysics, and in particular, his rejection of the mentalist or dualist view of language and thought. I could be wrong, but it seems to me that the dualist idea of language and thought, critiqued so relentlessly by Wittgenstein, has morphed into today's neural net models of language in machine learning, whereas Wittgenstein himself had preferred a strikingly different metaphor when he argued in philosophical investigations that language was a system of architecture out there, the stuff that makes up the social fabric, not something hidden behind in everybody's brain. Quote, language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods. You can read it. As I was walking around Venice last night after I arrived, I thought of this quote. I think, you know, here, this is not surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs, by straight, regular streets and uniform houses. Quite the opposite. He would have changed his description a little bit when it applies to Venice. To be sure, we humans inhabit these buildings and streets, and we add bricks and alleys to the city, and eventually pass them on to the next generation. Metaphors aside, let me explain first what I mean by logos and pathos in the title of my talk. I'm not referring to the classical modes of persuasion involving reason and emotion. In the context of natural language processing, the idea of logos could include words, tokens, and other symbolic units one can feed into the machine. It's interesting that whenever we're impressed by the computer's ability to manipulate these symbols or pass a Turing test, we associate its superior reasoning power with the intelligence. But something always gets left out in these kinds of reflections. For instance, what is the role of the pathological in the making of so-called intelligence machines? I'm not talking about the kind of clever emotion machines that Marvin Minsky had in mind when he called himself a neo-Freudian. What interests me about the role of the pathological in the making of AI machines is what it can tell us about some of our deeply held convictions about logos, call it word, reason, and so on, and its relation to pathos, feeling, emotion, affect, and so on. I know some of the talks over the next few days will address this issue. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to take you through the very first chatbots that were created in the 60s and 70s, with which you're already familiar. But think about this. These early chatbots were invented to simulate the pathological and unthinking behavior, not thinking behavior, anything but intelligence. So this is the most familiar one, ELIZA, right? And then there are many, I'm just giving you three. Kolbe's Parry, which is a simulation program simulating a paranoid patient. And then the third one might not be so familiar. I'm going to talk more about this. Abelson's The Ideology Machine. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through them and show you why these have nothing to do with intelligence. Okay. Oh, you all know, have heard about Eliza, the first ever chatbot that was built. It was considered an exciting breakthrough in the 60s. But when Joseph Weizenbaum wrote his script doctor for Eliza at MIT, he did not make any claims about the machine's intelligence.
Does it understand what it's doing in the sense that we do? It's easy to leap to false conclusions, as Professor Weizenbaum discovered when he created Eliza. Eliza is a computer program that anyone can converse with via the keyboard, and it'll reply on the screen. We've added human speech to make the conversation more clear.
Men are all alike.
In what way?
They're always bugging us about something or other.
Can you think of a specific example?
Well, my boyfriend made me come here.
Your boyfriend made you come here.
He says I'm depressed much of the time.
I'm sorry to hear that you're depressed.
It's true. I am unhappy.
Do you think coming here will help you not to be unhappy?
The computer's replies seem very understanding, but this program is merely triggered by certain phrases to come out with stock responses. Nevertheless, Weizenbaum's secretary fell under the spell of the machine.
And I asked her to my office and sat her down at the keyboard, and then she began to type. And of course, I looked over her shoulder to make sure that everything was operating properly. After 2 or 3 interchanges with the machine, she turned to me and she said, "Would you mind leaving the room, please?"
And yet she knew, as Weizenbaum did, that Eliza didn't understand a single word that was being typed into it.
Okay, so I'm sure you're familiar with this. Weizenbaum insists that, quote, that the sense and continuity of the person conversing with Eliza perceives is supplied largely by the person himself. We all know this. And he says it's just as he might do with what a fortune teller says to him. Some of my students at Columbia confess that they use ChatGPT primarily for this purpose. They call it self-healing therapeutic. And I said I was not surprised. In any case, Weizenbaum then ended up collaborating with Kolbe and then had a split with Kolbe for the kind of claims that Kolbe makes about his paranoid the cognitive function of his Parry. I'm not going to skip that and go right to the third example, Robert Abelson, his ideology machine. I don't think this chatbot is as well known as Eliza or Parry in the narrative history of chatbots, but I think it gives us the most penetrating insight into the nature of computer-simulated speech as it was conceived in the 60s and 70s. This work attracted my attention when I was writing my book, The Freudian Robot, many years ago. And at that time, I was exploring the development of the cybernetics in the Cold War. What I didn't realize was that Abelson and his collaborator, Roger Schenck, were directly responsible for John Searle's provocative thought experiment, which you all know, the Chinese room controversy. What happened was that Schenck, who wrote the program Margie, and Abelson were creating their new AI lab at Yale University. At that time, it was called the Yale Artificial Intelligence Project. They invited John Searle to give a talk on philosophy and cognitive science. Searle didn't know a thing about AI. In the process of preparing his talk, he read just a single book. This is the book that these Yale scholars co-authored, as you probably know, and then he came out with an attack on these two people. Okay, so I just took one paragraph, and people usually overlook this paragraph as they focus on his argument. He says, I will consider the work of Roger Schenck and his colleagues, and here is Abelson, because I'm more familiar with it than I'm with other similar claims, because it provides a very clear example of the sort of work I wish to examine. But then he says, but nothing that follows depends on the details of Schenck's systems. He didn't actually look at what they built. He simply read the book. Okay, so then you're familiar with his argument, so I'm not going to repeat it. I just give you this Abelson's rebuttal here about programming, about understanding, and I wanted to, this was his rebuttal, but then I think the strongest rebuttal was his ideology machine. The ideology machine is the last quote. It's not demonstrable that we know what we're talking about. It's a conceit, not an insight, to give ourselves more credit for comparable performance. Okay, so the ideology machine, what was it? Was set up to simulate responses to foreign policy questions. Basically, he designed a very simple script to mimic the speech of politicians in the Cold War. For instance, so the person Abelson mimicked was Senator Barry Goldwater, who was a presidential candidate in 1964. He was defeated by Lyndon Johnson. Okay, how does he talk?
I'll say so that all American people can hear that the only enemy of peace in the world is communism. And I don't care whether it's Red Chinese communism or Russian communism or whose communism it is, it's communism.
So they still talk like that, and so it hasn't dated. So what's going on? I think this is ingenious machine. It raises fascinating questions about how human speakers relate to language through automatic discourse, not through reasoning or thinking. And then if these processes can be captured or programmed by the computer, it doesn't mean that the computer can therefore think and understand language. Not at all. It simply means that we humans don't always know what we're talking about. That is what Abelson said. The ideology machine is a perfect demonstration of this. Namely, social discourse can be automatic and need not involve reason, consciousness, intentionality, even thought. So those are the things that John Searle argued when he rejected strong AI, if you recall. So it's very interesting. It's something that psychoanalysts have worked on, Freud and Lacan, about Freud, the pathological, not rationality, defines the human condition. His many books try to do this work. And Lacan, especially his work on the symbolic order, re-examined Freud's original argument about repetition compulsion through the language machine. So I won't go into this because I had some discussion, in-depth discussion of it in the Freudian Robot. Now, so what we see is absence, not the presence, in the human speaker of rationality, understanding, consciousness, or intelligence. And so it's not a argument you can just make about the machine there. Okay, and I'm now coming to Wittgenstein's position on this question about exactly what happens when we speak. Does it involve intelligence? Wittgenstein says it's misleading than to talk of thinking as a mental activity. We may say that thinking is essentially the activity of operating with signs. This activity is performed by the hand. Then when we think about writing, we think by writing, by the mouth and larynx, then when we think about speaking, and if we think by imagining science or pictures, I can give you no agent that thinks so. So don't look for a single agent that thinks that somehow is the brain. And then if, again, we talk about the locality where thinking takes place, we have a right to say this locality is the paper on which we write or the mouth which speaks. And if we think of the head or brain as the locality of thought, this is using the direction locality thinking in a different sense. All right, okay. So when mathematicians write on the board, they write, that's how they perform thinking, right, on the blackboard. This is from the Blue Book. I'm going to talk more about the Blue Book later. So perhaps the main reason why we're so strongly inclined to talk of the head as the locality of thought is this. They exist in the words thinking, thought, alongside other words, such as writing, speaking. So essentially, this is a typical Wittgensteinian argument. We're led by language to make certain associations, and we think, and that is the case. So it's language that pushes us in a certain direction, such as making analogies and things like that. Okay, so that brings me to the second part of my talk. I hope I won't exceed the time. The ontology of logos in the machine. I really have to, I've been doing research on this group of researchers in Cambridge. Involving the Cambridge Language Research Unit. They've made so many experiments while they were building a machine translation, and then their work can give us some, insight as to what to make of our relationship to language. And the reason that I'm bringing them up is because Margaret Masterman, who founded the Institute, was Wittgenstein's student. And she and Alice Ambrose transcribed the manuscript in his class, which eventually became the Blue Book, which you just saw. That was the book. So, and she became a very important pioneer in NLP, and basically one of the founders of the discipline. So there's my argument. I wrote an article that Amira mentioned. My argument is that Wittgenstein didn't come later when people like John Soa, when they invented conceptual graphs. He was there right from the beginning because Masterman was doing philosophy on the machine, his student there. So this is how Wittgenstein's philosophy, late philosophy, was introduced into the NLP programs of CLRU, including machine translation. They also worked extensively on information retrieval. And then from the late 50s onwards. And Margaret Masterman had this ongoing rejection of Chomsky, the MIT group. I won't go into that. Their use of the method she called sentence parsing. And so there, they made early contributions to machine translation. In one of the first programs they built was called Machine Interlingua. They also created mechanical thesaurus, semantic, and then she was the one who invented semantic nets or semantic networks there. So 50s and 60s, very early. One of their members, Yorick Wilkes, later went to Stanford and got to know Roger Schank. You see the connection there? And so definitely there were interactions between the Cambridge group and the AI groups there. Okay, so the main thing I'm looking at is the philosophical breakthrough. I'm not talking about technological aspect of it, because they were mostly interested in doing philosophy on the machine there. So essentially, that the goal was to overcome logocentrism. How did they do that? Because on the machine they realized, when they were doing this early machine translation on the semantic basis, that it was very difficult to determine the identity of a word. So where does it end? Where does it begin? So these were philosophical difficulties. How to identify semantic units of words? So early attempt to tokenize words, word units. And it was a very interesting process. I'm not going to go into the details. I wanted to also bring in the name of Halliday, who was an early member of CLRU. He puts it very clearly why this was a difficulty. That is because people are often conflated three levels: the grammatical word, the lexical item, and the orthographic unit. And they are trying to break away from the tyranny of the grammatical work. So how would they do that? Through their insistence on building semantic models. That was difficult at that time. Okay, so where then would they go? They went to the Blue Book, Philosophical Investigations. By the way, the Blue Book wasn't officially published until 1958. But Philosophical Investigations came out earlier, in 1953. But the actual order was the reverse. Wittgenstein started dictating the book manuscript in 1933 through 1934. And Masterman was in the class. Okay, the question, what is the meaning of a word? I'm not going to go through this. It's a very typical Wittgensteinian inquiry to push the nonsense of people's usual questions about the meaning of a word in a certain direction. So just keep in mind, his question was, what is the meaning of a word? It doesn't mean that he was interested in the question. He was evoking the question that everybody asks. So he's going to dismantle that. And then in 1954, after Wittgenstein's death, a few years, Masterman came out with a very interesting essay called Words. And her first question was, to the question, what is a word? Okay, so it's not the meaning of a word. What is a word? Then philosophers didn't usually think about that. They think propositions are what matter, syntax. But she says, no. Words, because they were working on machine translation, you really have to work with. There's a practical difficulty. And take, for example, in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, and he shows the difficulty of determining the meaning of a sign. Here is an ideographic sign, a triangle. Take as an aspect a triangle. He says this triangle can be seen as a triangular whole, as solid, as geometrical. So there are many things here. So then what Masterman did with this, and she actually went ahead and modeled Wittgenstein's example to demonstrate what Wittgenstein meant by family resemblances of what we call synonyms. And this was in the course of building their mechanical thesaurus. Okay, so then he puts, she and her group put head or ideograph on top, and then to demonstrate the multiplicity of meanings and the openness of meanings as context change, so what uses there. So essentially, she actually used the Chinese concept of 字 in that essay, and she was looking for a certain concept that would transcend word borders. And she spelled it as TZU, Today, in the pinyin spelling, we call it ZI, it's called 字. And you already know this. Emoji, the last one, ji, is the Japanese pronunciation of this character, emoji, right? So it's already there. But it was in Masterman's original mechanical thesaurus. And so we don't see it because she says, okay, why don't we apply this ideographic idea to English? And we discovered that there are 字 in English as well. And so this is how she then tries to spell out what the distinction is between word and ideograph, conceptually. I mean, these are philosophical problems, not just technical. Why does the semantic network require ideographic determination? And here, she shows semantic networks. The head is actually a 字, not a word. And she uses capitalized letters to demonstrate English 字. A head is a total set of word uses. Concept is the overlap meanings. Semantic aggregate. Okay. And then the basic unit of calculation in the computable thesaurus is heads, not words. Okay. So it sounds very interesting. They use the mathematical letters to do this. Right? Okay. Basically, it's a very Wittgensteinian move there as they were building these early models. Of course, today, people have more sophisticated models. You have greater compute, and all of they can do more. So I'll finally give you this example, Masterman's example. She uses ward. Okay. Ward means a person or minor under protection. It means a room in a hospital. It means, to parry in fencing. It means a proper name. They ask, are they the same words? Or is it one word with many meanings, polysemy? So the undecidability is something that really interested them, philosophically speaking. So are we looking at many words? One meaning, many words, one written sign? Or are we looking at one word with many meanings? You see, these are different, they were debating this. Okay, so now you can easily use, I just pulled out the British National Corpus and show you the actually existing usage, which would have interested Wittgenstein and Masterman. So they were not interested in propositional logic and the ways in which you analyze sentences, the ways in which, well, a lot of people at MIT did their machine translation. Instead, they were interested in the actual data of language use. Again, this is Wittgenstein. Okay, so we can debate this, and many of you know this better than I do about vector space semantics and how that represents more advanced ways of thinking about multiplicity, closeness, remoteness of meanings, and the relation among words. Okay, and then also word sense disambiguation. They started with this. Later now you have David Jarosky doing a new version of it. I don't know if he was aware of the Cambridge Language Institute, Research Institute's work. And John Soa, and so on and so forth. So there are people who are interested in Wittgenstein, but I don't think they're aware of Masterman's work, and it was already in the early models of language they built. Okay, so I'm going to finally conclude with this. We have so many metaphors for language. You have neural network architecture, but then ancient city architecture, which was Wittgenstein's quote that I brought up. I'm going to leave this with you, and I just conclude here. I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Well, we'll take questions. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for a great talk. I just have a note on the genealogy. I think there's an interesting link there. Just a note on the genealogy that I think M.A.K. Halliday is one of the few people who continued the work of J.R. Firth, who is one of the two figures that are evoked in order to justify linguistically the distributional hypothesis. So I think there's an important genealogical link potentially to add to this amazing work that you've been doing in between Firth and Halliday.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Halliday's work, and the moment I started paying attention to him, I noticed like Vinograd, a lot of these early AI pioneers drew on their work. Yes, thank you so much.
I saw another question by, Tommaso.
So my question is, what about the Wittgenstein theory of language as a dialogue or a social situation? Because I don't understand that the idea is that machine translation taken from Wittgenstein philosophy of language. But Wittgenstein also have a sort of idea about, I don't know, Turing machines. They discuss in the lesson of the philosophy of mathematics. So for me, the idea of language for Wittgenstein is something social, or in a dialogue situation between a person. I don't know how to implement this idea of Wittgenstein in the idea of machine translation. This is the question.
Yes, absolutely. He doesn't use social that much. It's very interesting. But essentially, dialogic, yeah. He always, well, let's put it this way. Discourse is what really interested him, right? Discourse would involve multiple speakers there. So you said you were surprised that that Masterman and her group were not working with that idea, or what was it? What was the question?
The question is, what is the relation between Wittgenstein's idea of language as a social interaction between organisms, humans? I don't know. Because Wittgenstein has also ideas about computation. And the idea of, I don't know, Wittgenstein's idea of the Turing machine is not a simulation of thought. It's a simulation of a part of the mind that is calculating. So
right.
It's
Turing, yes. Turing showed up in his class in 1939, right? That was before Turing had his the Turing machine, right? And Turing sent his first essay to Wittgenstein. So they had extensive conversation, and it's very clear from the transcription of their conversation in the class that Wittgenstein had a lot of respect for Turing. But I'm not sure he would, sort of go as far as the Turing machine. It's very interesting that some people claim that Turing's 1950 piece, in which he brought up the imitation game, starts with a Wittgensteinian kind of argument. He says, I'm not going to start with a definition. I'm going to give you a scenario, a thought experiment. So that seems like, to some people, very much Wittgensteinian. But Wittgenstein talks a lot about the machine. He would say, is the machine in pain? Does the machine have toothache? Of course, nonsensical sentences. He starts with this to really shock people out of their way of making analogies. I don't know about the mathematical conversation, to what extent he would be aligned with Turing. But as far as the machine is concerned, he has very interesting critiques of people thinking that the machine can do this, and he says, oh, are you getting your metaphors mixed up? Misplaced analogies. That I can say. Mm-hmm.
Yes, over there.
Thank you. That was amazing. I have a question about the Cambridge Language Research Unit. You know, in the U.S., linguistics was like profoundly affected, or the study of language, I would say, in different disciplines was profoundly affected by the sort of Chomskyan perspective and the cognitivist sort of developments at MIT and elsewhere. How did those developments affect the theories emerging from Cambridge? You know, yeah, positive or negatively?
I don't know about Chomsky. I know for sure because on many occasions Masterman criticizes Chomsky. And she basically dismisses the whole MIT and also US approach. She never ever made cognitive claims about what they were doing. And in fact, Karen Spark-Jones, whom whose work Anne knows very well, also in a later piece about what is artificial intelligence, she says, we're not interested in building machines that imitate human beings, and that's not what we're doing. So there is no cognitive dimension because Masterman, being a philosopher, being a Wittgensteinian philosopher, would question how people, cognitive scientists can connect thought with language. So they just don't go there, which is very interesting. So for them, certainly language is social, it's out there. It's not in the brain. And the brain is part of it, but it's the larger world. Social as well as historical, because we have the ancient city model there. So language is many things, it's not one thing. And therefore, they could not accept the kind of syntactical analysis which would say, oh, does this make sense? Is this a nonsense statement? Or let's work this out. How can we resolve the nonsense? In fact, for Wittgenstein, nonsense is very central in understanding how people talk. Yeah. It's not.
Yet?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I have a question. I'm interested also in a longer trajectory of your work. And therefore, I would like to maybe situate also your current research in regards to previous publication. I see, for example, that the question of logocentrism emerge here, as it did also in a different field in the Freudian robot, when you were talking about printed English and Shannon.
Yeah.
I'm interested also in other works like Clash of Empires, or when you analyze global circulation of tokens, and I specifically also reference that back then you made to the political economy, which involved with translations. And do you think that your current work is also, how does it sit in relation to this previous trend of research? Is it a continuation? Is it a parallel trajectory? I see that you enter very deep into the lab and into the work that was done in Cambridge. I'm very much interested in also the part of your work that was trying to analyze larger frameworks. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. This is ongoing work. I published 2 essays, but I realized from talking to a lot of colleagues, and I was actually in Anne's office when she was chair of the computer department, looking through Karen Spark-Jones' papers, and I haven't finished doing that. And there are also archives in Cambridge, Amira told me, scattered in various places. So I look forward to the fall when I'm taking my research leave. I will spend a few months there just looking through. So this is very new work. and see where these sources will take me. I'm always interested in archival work because I think there is an opportunity to do some philosophical work there. The Clash of Empires also, this is a very different set of archives where I also focus on language. And so I think language is the thing, but it's something that puzzles me, has been puzzling me for a long time. I try to take this from a number of angles, the historical, the psychoanalytic, and now more philosophical. It's simply, and also I'm fascinated by how central language has become now in a totally different sense, which, so I'm interested in a certain historical perspective on where we can take this philosophical work, how far we can take this historical work. The other thing is translation. Masterman's work, the whole Cambridge group's work will focus on machine translation. I think I started getting interested in when I was finishing the Freudian robot. Yeah, you mentioned Shannon. This is really something that is quite extraordinary. Shannon changed the English alphabet by adding a 27th letter. People don't pay attention to it. So the logocentrism that he's moved, displaced by inventing the 27th letter, which is space letter. Was surprising, that was surprising. So I did that work. I think technology, that kind of a communication technology led to some interesting philosophical insights there. So I usually am drawn to those philosophical insights, whether it be Claude Shannon or Jacques. I just don't think it's fruitful to apply psychoanalysis to any set of situations, because in the 50s, Derrida was reading cybernetics, he was reading game theory, he was reading information theory, and so he completely reframed Freud's idea of language. And so the historical perspective then I think can give us some unique pathway toward understanding the problem language. So that's language. I don't know if I answered your question. It's very difficult to summarize one's own work.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, I was really interested when you were talking about locality of thinking and what are the implications, and if you can expand on that when you use a language that relates on ideograms, and what's the difference, no, from Eastern and Western perspective, if you have done some deepening in your work. Thank you.
Yeah. Masterman studied Chinese with some Cambridge linguists, including Halliday. That was in the 40s. She started studying Chinese. Who knows why she decided to study Chinese? I'm still trying to find out. When I'm in Cambridge, I will probably find some papers. Someone told me that there are some records there and why she got interested in Chinese. But it's interesting, she wasn't there to do linguistics or learning a foreign language. She was doing philosophy. It's difficult to describe this in a talk. Wittgenstein in the Machine, that article, gives some details. Because she was interested in a different logic, which she calls like the mathematical combinatorial logic. and she was rejecting propositional logic. And then she says the Chinese, she calls classical Chinese language, it demonstrates that very well. And she was trying to improve on Wittgenstein's picture theory of language. And she says, you don't have to look anywhere else. You just look at Chinese language. And then she constructs this very sophisticated kind of logical relations among Chinese words in a sentence. And she says, it's not about a pictograph. It's about a logical relationship among concepts. And so that was the kind of work she did. And because they were having trouble trying to translate words on the basis of words like logos, making the machine automate that process, because machine would get it wrong. English, French, and words don't translate into words. And so they had to build this ideographic model, which was a semantic model. So she drew inspiration from the combinatorial logical analysis of Chinese language to do that kind of work. And so heads came out on the basis of that. So again, it's her attempt to build the picture theory of Wittgenstein. And she was very interested. She says, Wittgenstein didn't know, he didn't say Wittgenstein didn't know what he was talking about, but he said Wittgenstein didn't know how truthful his statement was in terms of constructing this kind of picture theory of language. But for Wittgenstein, it was the question of figuring out logical spaces, and because people tend to conflate them. And so he often, in his teaching, used ideograms, diagrams, drawings, just to, and what he called patterns. He says, we can do patterns in any number of ways, like with drawing, but we can also say number 1, 2, 3. And Wittgenstein says, why don't we say 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 as 1, 2, 3. So he actually played with this a lot and eventually wanted to determine the distinction between word and pattern. This is where Masterman's work came in. I hope I made myself clear. The essays is clearer there.
Thank you so much for the talk. I don't really have a question. I just had some thoughts in response to Tommaso's question. I think his question was about how Wittgenstein's conception of language as social enters into Masterman's project of automating the thesaurus. And I think Tommaso was alluding to the concept of form of life, or Lebensform. And I'm sure you know a lot more about this than I do, Lydia, but so feel free to have an input. But I just wanted to remark that Masterman's project was remarkably, her view of language was remarkably social. I mean, for one thing, the thesaurus is a social artifact. Yes. There are heads in a thesaurus that represent words that have different meanings and different contexts, so that is one thing. But also she was obsessed by the context on the page, so the typesetting. So she was looking at the word, for instance, W-A-R-D, as you were showing. And she was sort of saying that it has different meanings depending on how, on its surroundings on the page, on whether it's italicized, for instance, how it's formatted. So there's a lot in Masterman's conception of language that extends beyond the sort of dictionary meaning of a word, and that extends beyond the text into the sort of social life of speakers. And so I just wanted to say that. So I do think she responds quite directly to Wittgenstein's conception of form of life. And obviously, the people who didn't respond to that were Chomsky and other people at MIT maybe who considered language to be dead and purely a system in the brain. So, yeah, I hope that answers sort of a bit of your question.
Yeah, very well put. It's interesting they don't use the word social. They use context, for example, a lot. Of course, context, we're talking about, and they talk about, you have a different use in a different context. Of course, imply human beings, there's so many multiple people using words, and there's an infinite extensibility of meanings as they travel through social context. They don't use social. I don't know why. Wittgenstein doesn't use social. Maybe he was a philosopher. He didn't want to. I don't know. He could have used social or social discourse, because you don't find language in people's. He actually says that. I don't have the quote on the slide. He says if you're going to find out what someone is thinking and you want to open up his brain, you're not going to find anything. Because the object of his thought is not in the brain. It's out there. Okay, so he makes it very clear, Wittgenstein. So let's not fetishize the brain. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case in cognitive science. I could be wrong, but their view of language, instead of taking language as this vast ancient city where we simply pass through, right? We inhabit them. And they inverted the mentalist model of language, said, oh, it's a neural brain. I guess there's too much messiness in social discourse for the computer to capture, I suppose. How do you compute social discourse in all its messiness and unpredictability? You simply can't capture. I don't know. Maybe that's why. I think it's very important also to pay attention to the philosophical work they both do, Wittgenstein. And we understand the assumption is that discourse is social. But then the philosophical work has to do with questions about under what circumstances a particular meaning would arise. How do you determine? And then they did fantastic philosophical work. I was really surprised by how much they really pushed the philosophical frontier. I mean, not just to establish language is social and discursive, but the whole philosophical of language, where people should be asking the question like the locality of thought. Do you have to localize this in one place? There is no one agent, Wittgenstein says. We are simply being led by our language to look for a single agent. And so I think there are many philosophical insights we can get from both of their work. And it's not against machine. By the way, precisely I'm showing that the AI lab has produced new philosophical insights that have gone beyond what philosophers of language can tell us in their traditional models.
Right, sorry. Again, can I just say thank you for your wonderful talk. It's been brilliant to hear. I wonder if I could ask you to go back to that comment you made about Derrida reading cybernetics, the information theory, and so forth. In part, it's maybe an intellectual history question, and sort of about disciplines, but I think it also maybe speaks to the word structuralism in the title of the conference today. I'm just wondering what your view is on the directionality of the thinking, so that it strikes me I mean, I've been working on some stuff to Levi-Strauss, and you know, he was attending things like the Macy conference, and same with, you know, Derrida, and Barthes uses a lot of informatics sort of language and all the rest of it. So there's a kind of importing of this language into French philosophical writing and so forth. I do wonder then if, to some extent, the post-structuralist move, they should have just held out longer for the big compute we have today and the kinds of units of meanings that we can work on today, because it suddenly changes the way we might think about post-structuralism. But that aside, I'm just kind of interested in your understanding of how well is the work that they were doing go back over to the work in computer science and data science and so forth. I can't quite find any evidence of it. And yet I kind of feel we're landing at a moment now where it's the work of structuralism and so forth is making so much sense. I mean, even now you were just referring to the way Wittgenstein would write, he's describing a vector space. And I just wonder how much kind of dialogue there is across these domains.
Yes, thank you for that question. I come from a background of literary theory. When I was in graduate school, I read a lot of these authors, Levi-Strauss and these French theorists. But then I later realized that French theory was produced in the United States, in French departments where they translated French theory. I had a problem with that. I wrote about it in the Freudian Robot. There's a chapter about how the translation of Lacan into English missed the whole development. For instance, even Lacan's biographer called the meeting between Levi-Strauss, Jacobson, and Lacan in New York as that great moment of structuralism. But then when you look very closely at it, that it was not the case. Jacobson most definitely was structuralist, and Levi-Strauss, but not Lacan. So if you look at Lacan's seminar in 1954 and 55, he was leading his students through the text of information theory and cybernetics. So I have a very different kind of view on the genealogy of structuralism. What happened in France, in post-war France, was that they translated von Neumann's work. They translated Norbert Wiener. In fact, Norbert Wiener had a very close relationship with the French mathematical community. And so, there was a enthusiasm for this newly imported theory from the United States, game theory, information theory. And then they reworked it, and some of it became French theory when it was translated into English. It's just amazing, this transatlantic exchange. One example is game theory. Game theory makes a distinction between game and play. In French, it's jeu. So when that whole thing was retranslated into English, into literary theory, everything became a play of signifiers. It got it wrong. Mathematics fell out of the picture. And therefore, Cold War cybernetics also fell out of the picture in that translation of French theory. So I think it's absolutely important to revisit structuralism and see what exactly was happening. The argument I make in the Freudian Robot is that a lot of people who make claims about structuralism didn't distinguish between writing and speech. Shannon's introduction of the 27th letter happened at the ideographic level, mathematically speaking, not at the level of speech, not language. So if you don't make a distinction there, I don't think Jacobson makes that distinction. He often confuses them. then we can't understand how the machine came on the scene at all. So absolutely, structuralism is something we need to rethink.
Any further questions? If not, I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and ask a final one. Cool. So yeah, thank you so much for this. It was incredibly rich, and one thing that struck me was that in many of the Wittgenstein quotes you presented us with, so in that particular type of Wittgenstein, we encounter embodied language. We encounter thinking and language through writing and speaking. We encounter language as a city. All of these are embodied. And so I was thinking about what did the CLRU do with the question of a disembodied and automated language, or did they just kind of see, you know, the computer as well as a kind of like mechanized body? And I'm interested in this partially because, I mean, the embodiment of language also is such a tricky problem in Lacan.
So Lacan was always talking about science in the symbolic order there. His students insisted on talking about language. So there is a divide there. That is the science, mathematical science and alphabetical science, these science on the one hand, and then language, speech on the other, right? So the machine works primarily with the science, the written science there, right? And of course, we're going to hear about speech, that's something else. But that machine can only do this kind of thing, right? So you probably thinking about the embodied. So embodiment of gesture, or what kind of embodiment?
Well, when you were showing us the Wittgenstein quote, right? Like when we write on a board,
yes,
we do this via body, and also the act of writing, I would say, is
right.
Like, you know, an embodiment of language in itself.
Okay, okay.
The same is true for speech.
Right. So he's making the argument, if you're looking for where thinking happens, it happens when you write on piece of paper, when you write on the blackboard. And then today he would have said it happened when you're typing into the computer. And it's not that it's happening here or there, it's just happening when you're performing the act, right? So is that a question of embodiment, or is it a question of I don't know, distributed work across platforms, across devices? So that's basically the idea of rejecting a locality for thought. That's where he is going. In fact, he's very interested in locality, because that's often where we conflate things. When you ask what is a word, he would probably ask, where is the word? Something like that.
Thank you very much. Let's all thank our speaker again. And very briefly, we'll not go straight into the coffee break. We'll have Xiaochang Li on directly after, but we'll have a 5-minute break. I think we need it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for wonderful questions. Thank you.